I kept them fed. I kept them warm. I kept them alive. That's the part nobody ever asked me about. Nobody sat down and said, "How did you manage, at 62 years old, with a bad knee and a fixed income, to raise 3 children who weren't supposed to be yours?" Nobody asked, because the answer didn't matter to anyone until there was money involved. My son left his kids with me on a Tuesday morning in October. I remember because the leaves were coming down hard that week, and I'd been planning to clean out the gutters before the first snow. He showed up at my door in Sudbury just after 8 in the morning with all 3 of them. Caleb was 9, Jenna was 6, and the little one, Max, had just turned 4. My son had a duffel bag over one shoulder, and that look on his face he used to get as a teenager, the one that meant he'd already decided something and was just waiting for me to catch up. His name is not something I'll say anymore. I've earned that right. He told me his wife had left him, that he needed 2 weeks to sort himself out, that the kids would be fine with me, better than fine, that I had the house and the yard, and didn't I always say I wished I saw them more? He put 3 backpacks by the door and kissed each of them on the top of the head and told them Grandpa's house was an adventure. Caleb looked at me with these careful eyes, already old for 9. Jenna held Max's hand. Max didn't know enough yet to understand what was happening. I stood on my porch and watched my son's truck back down my driveway and turn onto the street and disappear. That was 12 years ago. He never called. Not that week. Not that month. By Christmas, I'd hired a family lawyer in Sudbury, a woman named Miss Ford, who helped me get emergency temporary guardianship because the kids couldn't be enrolled in school without it. Caleb started grade 4 in January, 4 months late. Jenna went into grade 1. Max, I kept home that year because he was still too young, and honestly because I needed one of them close. My knee was bad, and the winters were brutal, and I won't pretend the first year wasn't the hardest thing I have ever done. I had my pension from 31 years at the paper mill. I had this house, which I owned outright, and a small RRSP I'd been too cautious to touch. I started touching it. You do what you have to. My neighbor, a retired school teacher named Vernon, used to come over Tuesday and Thursday evenings and sit with the kids while I did groceries or went to my physiotherapy appointments. He'd bring a deck of cards and teach them games I'd never heard of. Caleb loved him immediately. Jenna took a few months. Max just climbed up on his lap one night and fell asleep there, and Vernon looked at me over the boy's head with this expression that said he understood exactly what we were doing here. Vernon never asked for a thing. He just showed up. I have never in my life been more grateful for a Tuesday evening. The years move the way hard years do, slowly when you're in them, impossible to account for when you look back. Caleb got into hockey at 12 and turned out to be serious about it. Jenna did well in school, quiet and determined, the kind of student teachers remember. Max grew up sunny, the way youngest children sometimes do when they've been properly loved, and he never lost that quality even as he got older and started to understand what his life actually looked like. They asked about their father, of course. Caleb stopped asking by the time he was 12 or 13. He'd done his own calculating by then. Jenna asked me once directly, when she was about 15, "Do you think he knows where we are?" I told her yes. She nodded and didn't ask again. Max asked me on his 16th birthday whether his father was still alive. I said I believed so. He said, "Okay," and went back to his friends, and that was the end of it for him. I did not tell them about the child support I'd tried to pursue, twice, through the courts. I did not tell them about the 2 letters I'd sent to an address in Fort McMurray which came back unopened. I did not tell them about the photograph I found online once, my son at some kind of outdoor party, laughing with a woman I didn't recognize, a beer in his hand, taken 5 years, after he'd left his children on my doorstep. I found it. I looked at it for a long time, and then I closed the laptop and went and made dinner. Some things a grandfather keeps to himself. Caleb was 21 when the knock came. He was home for the weekend from his welding apprenticeship in North Bay. Jenna was 18, in her first year at Laurentian. Max was 16 and had a hockey game the next morning. I remember all of this exactly the way you remember the hours before something goes wrong. It was a Friday evening in March. Cold, the way March in Sudbury always is, that particular gray cold that won't quit. I was at the stove when Caleb answered the door. I heard a voice I recognized immediately, not because I'd heard it recently, but because the body holds on to sounds longer than the mind does. It was my son's voice, 12 years older, but unmistakable. I turned off the burner and walked to the front hall. He was standing in my doorway with a woman I'd never seen before and a man in a suit who was holding a leather document case. My son looked at me and said, "Dad, just that." Like 12 years was a pause in conversation. The woman introduced herself as his wife, recently married. The name didn't matter. The man with the document case identified himself as a paralegal from a firm in Toronto. And then my son who I had not heard from in 12 years, who had never sent a birthday card or a Christmas call, who had left 3 small children on my steps and vanished, told me he was here for his kids. I said they're not kids anymore. He said that was a matter for the courts to decide. He said he had a lawyer. He said the word custody, and then he said another word, and it took me a moment to register it because it was so far from anything I'd anticipated. The word was kidnapping. Caleb was standing 4 feet behind me. He was 21 years old and built like a man who worked with his hands, and he went very still in a way that was worse than if he'd shouted. I said, "You left them. You left them here, and you never called." My son said that was one version of events. The paralegal handed me a document. I didn't read it at the door. I told them to leave my property. The woman started to say something, and I told her again, quietly, to leave. They left. I closed the door and turned around, and Caleb was still standing there, his jaw tight, and I said, "Go check on Max. Don't say anything yet." I sat down at the kitchen table with the document and my reading glasses, and I read every word. What they were claiming was extraordinary. The document stated that I had, in 2013, taken the children from their father's care without consent and relocated with them. It stated that my son had made repeated attempts to locate the children. It stated that I had interfered with his parental rights. There was a court date. There was a lawyer's name at the bottom, a firm from Toronto I'd never heard of. I sat with that document for a long time. Then I called Miss Ford. She was semi-retired by then, but she remembered me. She listened to everything, and then she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Walter, do you still have the original guardianship paperwork?" I said yes. She said, "Do you have anything from him? Anything in writing?" I thought about the 2 letters I'd sent to Fort McMurray. I thought about the envelope I had in my filing cabinet, the one I'd kept for reasons I couldn't have explained at the time, just a feeling that some things need to be held on to. I said, "I think so." She said, "Find it. Find everything." I went to my filing cabinet, 3rd drawer, toward the back. 12 years of guardianship renewals, school enrollment records, medical consent forms, dental records, the kids' immunization cards in a green sleeve, report cards in a stack, and behind all of that, in an envelope I'd sealed and labeled the week he left, a single sheet of paper. It was a note, handwritten, in my son's handwriting, on the back of a Sudbury grocery receipt. It said, "I know this isn't fair. I'm not okay right now, and I can't give them what they need. I trust you. I don't know when I'll be back. I don't know when I'll be back." I sealed it again, and I sat with it in my hands, and I let myself feel what I needed to feel about that sentence, which was quite a lot, and then I put it in my coat pocket and I didn't let go of it. What happened over the next 3 months is still difficult to walk through clearly. My son's lawyer filed a motion arguing that my emergency guardianship, now 12 years old and renewed several times, had been obtained fraudulently, that I'd misrepresented my son's intentions. They found a former neighbor of mine, a man named Dale, who'd moved away years ago and apparently fallen on hard times, who signed an affidavit saying he'd heard me tell people my son had permanently surrendered the children, which was an exaggeration of what I'd said and was being used to argue I'd knowingly misled the court. They were trying to build a picture of me as someone who had manipulated a desperate father. The Family Services Office contacted me. A caseworker named Ms. Boudreau came to the house, young, professional, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. She interviewed me. She interviewed Max, who by now knew everything. She asked him carefully whether he felt he had been raised in a safe environment. Max looked at her and said, "This is the only safe environment I've ever had." She wrote something down. I didn't ask what. Caleb drove down from North Bay and sat in on my meetings with Miss Ford. He didn't say much. He just wanted to be there. One evening, after one of those meetings, he sat across from me in my kitchen and said, "Why is he doing this?" I had thought about that question a great deal. My honest answer was that my son's new wife wanted a family, and my son had one available somewhere that he'd never bothered to clean up after. Whether he actually believed his own version of events, I couldn't say. Some people tell a story often enough that it becomes the one they live in. Jenna flew back from university for the court dates she could manage. She was the one who found the Facebook posts, old ones from 2014 and 2015, which my son himself had made, vague but unmistakable. References to starting over, to leaving things behind, to what you owe yourself. She printed every one of them. The night before the first major hearing, Vernon came over. He brought a bottle of scotch that was considerably better than anything I kept in the house, and he sat with me at the kitchen table, and we didn't talk about the case very much. He talked about his late wife. I talked about mine, gone 19 years now, and how she would have handled all of this with considerably more grace than I was managing. Vernon said, "I'll come to court." I told him he didn't have to. He said, "I know." He came anyway. He sat in the gallery for 2 full days. The morning of the second hearing was when it went sideways in a way I hadn't anticipated. Miss Ford had presented the guardianship records, all 12 years of them. She had presented the note. The note was the centerpiece of everything. My son's own handwriting on a grocery receipt, 12 years old, saying he didn't know when he'd be back. His lawyer argued the note was fabricated. My son took the stand and said he had not written it. I was 64 years old, sitting in a provincial court in Sudbury, listening to my son tell a judge he had never written words that I had read 1,000 times. I want to be honest about what that felt like. It felt like something breaking that I hadn't known was still intact. But here is what my son's lawyer didn't know. The grocery receipt on the back of that note was from a Sudbury store that had closed in 2016. The date printed at the top of the receipt was October 14, 2013. 4 days after he'd left the children with me. Miss Ford had brought in a document examiner, a woman from Ottawa, who had verified the ink age, the paper condition, the handwriting against 2 other samples of my son's writing from legal documents he'd signed. The examiner took the stand and walked the court through every detail with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this many times and found the result unremarkable. The judge asked my son's lawyer if he wished to cross-examine. There was a pause that lasted, I think, about 4 seconds. It felt considerably longer. He said no. My son's case collapsed not dramatically, not the way it does in films, but quietly and completely. The fabrication charge against me was dismissed. The motion to overturn my guardianship was denied. The judge made note in her ruling that the children in question were now adults, that the eldest two had submitted written statements on their own behalf, and that the record of their upbringing was extensive, consistent, and unambiguous. She also noted, in language that I found careful and precise, that the court took a dim view of parties who bring proceedings founded on knowingly false testimony. My son and his wife and his lawyer left the courthouse. I stood on the steps in the March cold with Miss Ford and Vernon and Caleb, who had driven down again for this, and for a moment, none of us said anything. Then Caleb said, "I want breakfast." So we went and got breakfast. A diner on Elm Street, vinyl booths, coffee that came in those thick ceramic mugs. Vernon ordered the full breakfast and ate every bite. I had eggs and toast, and I couldn't finish either, but I sat there and I was warm and I was people I loved, and that was enough. That was more than enough. Jenna called from Laurentian when it was over. She cried a little, which she'll probably deny. Max texted me 6 consecutive emojis and then called immediately after, laughing at himself. He said, "Grandpa, I didn't know what else to say." I told him the emojis were fine. There are things that came after. Miss Ford filed for costs, and we received a partial award that helped offset what the past 3 months had cost me, which had been significant. The Crown Attorney's Office reached out to Miss Ford separately. That conversation, I understood, was about the false testimony my son had given. I don't know where that ended. I stopped following it. Some doors I chose not to open. I did one thing I want to mention. A few weeks after it was over, I took Vernon to dinner at a proper restaurant, the kind with cloth napkins and a wine list, which is not usually either of our style. I told him I didn't know what the right way was to thank someone for what he'd done for me and for those children over 12 years. He told me not to embarrass him. We had the beef and a bottle of red, and we talked for 3 hours. And when we left, he shook my hand at the door and held it for an extra moment, and I think that said everything that needed saying. Caleb finished his apprenticeship and works now in Timmins. He calls me on Sundays. How was Jenna graduated and is doing her master's in social work, which surprised no one who knew her. Max is 18, in his final year of high school, and he has been offered a spot in a junior hockey program in Sault Ste. Marie that he is trying to decide about. He talks to me about it the way he talks to me about most things, directly. Turning it over, asking what I think. I tell him what I think, and then I tell him it's his life, and he gets to choose it. He was 4 years old when he came to me. He didn't know what was happening. He just held his sister's hand on the porch and looked up at me. I think about that sometimes. How little we know at 4 about what we're going to need from each other, how much we figure out anyway. I kept them. That's all. I kept them, and it turns out that was everything.